And thank you very much to WUPAC, University Palestine Action Committee, for arranging this teach-out session. Thanks also to History Workshop for facilitating the venue and the speaker, and maybe the snacks, although no one is saying responsibility. And the snacks. Sorry, online people, you're missing out on the snacks. But without more ado, I think it's about 2:20, and I think we have till 4 o'clock. So I think, Noor, you said you'd be quick. Does that mean like 5 hours as opposed to the normal 10?
Yeah, something like that.
So 20 minutes perhaps, maximum, and then Joe, maybe 20 minutes, and then we should have enough time for discussions and questions and comments, which is important, I think, on these issues. So, Noor, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roshan. The order of this was supposed to be Joe with the big speech, and I was going to sit and check where the gaps are, and then sound like coherent by trying to fill in some gaps. But I'm very happy to go first. I see Ahmed has left. So I was very nervous about my introduction, because I was going to misquote him, and now I can do it without him telling everyone else that I'm lying. And it goes something like this. An hour and a half ago, I, in a panic, contacted Ahmed and asked, Comrade Chair, what is the mandate? What do you want me to say, okay? And he said to me, Comrade, you've got to provide a 10-point program for what we must do in Palestine in the world revolution. I decided, which is something I don't often do, is to go against his instruction. And rather than provide a 10-point program, I thought that what I should do is to provide a fairly kind of personal, and by that I mean also political, kind of understanding of how I view my own intervention in what is happening at the moment. Because I don't want to pretend that I know what everyone else wants or what they should be doing. And then we can have a conversation from there. And I really want to start off by saying that amidst the unfolding genocide, I have kind of oscillated between kind of despair, paralysis, and extreme anger. And the first framing of what I want to say, therefore, is about how one tries to counter the despair and sense of paralysis, and how does one channel the kind of deep anger in multiple ways. And I'm only going to suggest kind of one line of thinking and intervention that certainly frames some of the things that I think about and do. So these are really fragmented thoughts, but I want to start, I think as we all should, in a kind of understanding of the Nakba. And I'm not going to go into any kind of analysis of the Nakba, but I want to make these 2 points from Ilan Pape's key work on the Nakba. And for those of you familiar with Pape's work, you'll know that perhaps one of his main interventions has been to develop the framing of ethnic cleansing, which in a number of his books, he locates, first of all, in its operational development and expansion, elaboration, in what was called Plan D or Plan Dalet, that was developed by Haganah in 1947. But he also locates that in the politics, in the ideologies of the late 19th century. And making that connection is really important. I want to come back to that. But what he also says, very importantly, about the Nakba is that it was very importantly about the physical destruction of the presence of Palestinian people, both as people, the places that they occupied, the land that they occupied, the homes that they occupied, the fields that they plowed, the schools they attended, the madrasas they attended. That kind of physical destruction was central to it. But he makes the important point that what was also happening and what is central to the ethnic cleansing program is memoricide. Okay? The attempt to erase the idea of the Palestinian people as people from the historical landscape of historical Palestine, and in fact beyond that, in the kind of collective memory of the world, is to kind of constantly try to erase Palestinian people. And I want to make that point about erasure because it has multiple facets to it. It has, crucially, and without repeating, the kind of physical aspect to it. And then during the Nakba 47 to 49, is the emerging Israeli state and the IDF and the various kind of components, the paramilitary terrorist organizations, also went about renaming, physically removing the presence of Palestinian people from the physical landscape. Towns were renamed, streets were renamed, etc., etc. But that memoricide did not end with the Nakba. In fact, it is a continuous process. So now, there are many, many examples, but I just want to relate two examples that have come to mind in the work that some of us in the history workshop have been doing in collaboration with colleagues from Palestine and Egypt and Lebanon. The first is, and I wasn't aware of this, during the 1967 war, the IDF invaded the headquarters of the PLO, and they stole all the archives. They kind of brought trucks in, and they removed the archive from the building, the head office of the PLO, and moved them to the IDF. And that was a continuation of this kind of erasure of the history of the people. And there have been attempts to kind of reclaim that archive, but it's been close to impossible. Secondly, in the 1980s, there was an important movement amongst historians called the kind of new historians of the 1980s, from which people like Ilan Pappé and then also an Israeli apologist, Benny Morris, kind of comes from. Right? And what those historians did is that they went into the Israeli archives, in fact, and uncovered many things about the Nakba. Okay? The violence, the rape, the torture of homes. And some of that we know now from this scholarship. And what has happened since the mid-1990s and even more recently is that the Israeli state has what they call shuttered the archives, their own archives, so that historians can't continue using the archives in order to do research. And one article kind of provides, reveals that the explanation given by the Israeli government is that they don't want the facts about the Nakba to be revealed because it would incite the Palestinian people to revolt. And they don't want the Palestinian people to be upset, okay, and therefore revolt. So the point I'm making, the first point I'm making, therefore, is that when we think about what those of us as activists at universities and beyond universities should be thinking about is simultaneously this kind of physical violence against the Palestinian people, the kind of erasure, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, but also this other dimension. And that the work that we must try to do as we urgently, immediately protest in solidarity, we also need to think about how we can contribute to challenging this constant erasure, and those of us in the academy, what we can do to contribute to a process, and I'll make one or two points now, of not only challenging the erasure, but about reproducing the rich multiple histories of the people of Palestine. Let me give you one example. Earlier this year, we took some students to Beirut, and we went into the Shatila camp, Palestinian camp. And there we were taken to a former medical doctor, and Ali, I simply can't remember his name, okay? And this man, former medical doctor, retired now, has been living in Shatila camp since the late 1940s, since he was forcibly removed from his home in Palestine. And he's just created this archive. And people have kind of brought things from all over the camp to this kind of almost underground room, okay? And of course, most importantly, keys, okay? Kettles, all sorts of things. And so the issue here is that against this sort of dominant erasure of Palestinian people, what has been happening, and the kind of attempt to close research by academics using the old archives, what one has seen as a counter to that is a new movement, I say new, the last 10, 15 years, of kind of consciously, more deliberately, in a more kind of organized way and coordinated way, to kind of produce new histories of Palestinian people. And so this uncle that we went to in Shatila camp is an individual, and the kind of people congregate around his space all the time. But across the MENA region, what we have encountered, and it's been going, of course, on long before we encountered it, are many, many young people, many activists, young scholars in various universities and beyond universities producing oral histories. Right? So the Institute for Palestine Studies, the Women in Memory Project, there are dozens of oral history projects, a kind of recognition that part of the campaign against the genocide, against ethnic cleansing, is about restoring the histories of Palestinian people by Palestinian people themselves, by activists and so on. So I said at the beginning, these are going to say, Ahmed has arrived, and he didn't hear my misrepresentation of him at the beginning, but others will report, okay? One of the reasons why I'm trying to emphasize the importance of the campaign against erasure is also about the importance of focusing on important elements of the history of this unfolding ethnic cleansing and genocide, which are often overlooked in the politics that we produce in solidarity. And I'm sorry, there's no time to kind of qualify and adorn all the kind of provocations I want to make, because there simply isn't time. So let me make this point, right? When we, as we are doing now, urgently organizing solidarity, what we tend to do is to focus on the here and now. And that's understandable, because it's so urgent that we act on the here and now. But typically what that means is that in the politics that we produce, we are not sufficiently attentive to the deeper histories, to the deeper underlying structural issues that explains the nature of the settler colonialism, and that should also inform the kind of politics we produce in solidarity. So let me make a few points very quickly, because, Comrade Chair,
You've got a few minutes.
I've got a few minutes.
Quickly.
Yeah, but that was my introduction.
Quickly.
I'm about to. I'm about to start
Okay,
with my
we've only
talk.
got 2 hours
Okay.
now.
No, but I'll be very quick. Okay. So the point I was going to make and elaborate on, but I'll now make very quickly, is it's been very interesting to me in this kind of moment of solidarity, as has been the case before, how many people know about certain things, about the Nakba, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and that's fantastic. But I very rarely hear people talk about Palestinian society before colonialism. And there's, for me, there are a number of worrying things there. One of the worrying things is that we only understand Palestinian people in the context or kind of in relation to colonialism, right? And there is a much deeper history that we need to become familiar with, because familiarizing ourselves with that history that goes back millennia, right, is that we can understand the nature of Palestinian society outside of the framework of, and I put here, contact with Europeans. And you're all going to watch Ridley Scott's epic on Napoleon, and what you will learn there that is when the Middle East was discovered. That is when the Rosetta Stone was discovered, right? And then Napoleon marches to Palestine, and Europeans become aware of Palestine, okay? But of course, it's all nonsense, right? But that is what you're all going to become kind of overwhelmed by in the next month or so. And so we need to understand the kind of deeper histories of these societies in order to understand, okay, what happened at the end of the 19th century. So very quickly, 3 points. Right? We need to understand the nature of Zionism. You can only understand the nature of Zionism if you understand that its origins in the late 19th century occurs at the moment in which racism, eugenics, social Darwinism intersect with the colonial project, with the high point of imperialism, as well as ideas around nationalism, new nationalist movements. Those elements are critical to understanding the meaning of Zionism. So in the first few years of the Zionist movement after 1897, at the conference in Basel, where Theodor Herzl presented his book on the kind of the ideas about creating a nation state, in fact, there was very little support for Zionism. And so the second point I want to make in an abbreviated form, Chair, is that Zionism gains traction for 2 or 3 reasons. And here I can only mention 2 of them. The one is, of course, the Holocaust and the kind of pogroms of the late 19th century, the attacks on Jewish people from the 1930s, and then the Holocaust. But even prior to that, and intersecting with that in key moments, is oil. And what that means for the nature of imperialism in the early 20th century and how it evolves. So there are 2 key developments. The first one is the founding of the Persian Oil Company, which becomes BP. The second one, and there's a kind of the 1928 Red Line Agreement, in fact divides the spoils of the oil industry between the US, Britain, and France. And other than the founding of the Persian Oil Company, the key development is the founding of Aramco, the Arabian American company. And Aramco becomes the key entity in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. One cannot understand this kind of nexus of global imperialism and the conservative Saudi regime and the role that Israel plays in this kind of nexus of politics, of imperialism, of oil production, of needing to control the Middle East, unless one understands the simultaneous evolution of these oil companies connected to global imperialism. If you don't understand that, we cannot comprehend what is happening today and what has happened to the Palestinian people throughout the 20th century, including the kind of inflection moments such as the Nakba in 1947. Okay, my third last point, okay? I'm also concerned in our understanding of this movement that very little attention is given consistently about the nature and unfolding nature of resistance in Palestine. And quite frankly, and again, I'm not going to kind of excuse my kind of brevity and lack of kind of qualification, we've kind of moved from supporting the PLO to Hamas. And I'm not saying that there's no place for that, okay? But in fact, what we do in that process is that we ourselves are guilty of an erasure of the resistance that has happened since Zionism originated every day in different kinds of movements, in different parts of Palestine, that cannot simply be organized under the rubric of either the PLO or today of Hamas. Right? And of course, the inflection moments, right, such as the 1936, 1937 general strike, first in the urban areas, and then amongst the Fellahin in the rural areas. Many of you won't know that that rebellion was crushed, and its kind of crushing coincided with the crushing of the Spanish Civil War. And there were 2 kind of almost coterminous moments, okay, that we all remember because of Picasso's Guernica, but we don't remember of Palestine. Because when the Germans kind of flew their aeroplanes and bombed Guernica, the British were doing the same in Palestine at exactly the same time, 1936, 1937. Right? And so we need to, I'm making that point kind of strongly because there are all these kind of moments of resistance that we need to understand, but also know that the crushing of the 1936, 1937 rebellion was absolutely crucial in the British colonial project of disarming, of weakening, and of fragmenting the Palestinian resistance. Again, one can't understand fully the success of the Israeli, of the Zionist terrorist organizations without understanding the kind of crushing of that rebellion. But now I've got to end, okay? And I apologize for going on too long. My real mandate, which I referenced at the beginning from my chair, Ahmed, was to say, comrade, what are we going to do? What is the future of our movement, okay? And so I've got 3, 4, just bullet points, just words, okay? So I think it's really critically important. I've been so impressed by the number of young people who have been part of this movement. I think that for those of us who went through Fees Must Fall and who despair, right, about the fact that many of the young people who were part of that movement have kind of gone in places they shouldn't have gone to, okay? We mustn't lose that moment again, right? A few weeks ago, one of those kind of young activists, who was not so young anymore, Pindili Kunene, said at the PSC meeting, we need to have the kinds of workshops, discussions like this, to ensure that young people can understand and become the kinds of activists like she and her friends with their hats at the back there have become, okay? Firstly. Secondly, direct links, all right? Now, in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a big debate in the South African international solidarity movement. There was a particular party that scolded the trade unions for organizing direct links, and they had a heading in their journal that said, direct links stink, okay? Which was fundamentally wrong. What we need to do is we need to build direct links with Palestinians, okay? And for scholars, for university, for academics, for students, and so on, it's absolutely crucial that we build direct links. That kind of solidarity is not easy, but it is fundamental to what we do. Because, and this is my final point, Chair, my great despair, next to the despair of the destruction of Palestine, is about the solidarity campaign. And that is, we only rise from our slumber during these moments. And so we need to think of a kind of solidarity that kind of is continuous, that is linked to building direct links, that can then, in that way, support the important campaigns, such as, for example, by the BDS. So we can't only say, boycott Cape Union Mart when we are angry because there's a genocide taking place. What do we do every day? And that, for me, is the kind of important focus that I hope our conversations here can give some attention to. And I'm going to end there, and sorry for the kind of fragmented, kind of sort of all over the place input, but I didn't have too much time to prepare. Thank you.
No, thanks, Noor. And you actually didn't go more than a minute over time, I'd say,
okay.
for once. But important points, erasure, ethnic cleansing and erasure, like practical physical erasure of the attempted erasure of Palestinian people, their histories, their culture and memories. Resistance, and I think that's something that will get picked up in the discussion, because I think that our attitude towards, or our boldness in talking about resistance has changed since 7th October. Certainly in the solidarity movements in South Africa. Direct links. There are also lots of young Palestinians in the diaspora now doing research on Palestine and South Africa and finding very interesting things in the archives in Beirut around that. Direct links, I think, yes, but I don't think it's disconnected. I mean, like with UJ, part of their campaigning for an academic boycott or the breaking of links with Ben Gurion was, within that agreement, was establishing institutional links with Berzai. So I think the two should go together, because you don't want to let the institution off the hook either, in terms of promoting an academic boycott. But let's move on quickly to Joe Bluen from SAJFP, who will have a little more than 20 minutes. 25 minutes.
Oh gosh. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Wupak, and thank you, History Seminar, and thank you, Noor. You said that you just had some fragmented notes and proceeded to present a very cohesive and contained argument. I do have fragmented notes, but I am going to pick up on some of the things to kind of tether them through the amazing things that have just been said now and the disturbing things that have just been said now. I think I'd like to pick up on the point of archives erasure and the question of words that you said towards the end. And one of the things I'm Jewish, I'm South African, I'm descended. So here's the cards that you have to do to get through the barriers to be able to say things that are so blatantly self-evident. I am descended of people who escaped the pogrom, survived the Holocaust, were less than white or differently white in Europe, became white in South Africa through the self-same processes of fascism that operates through racecraft that informed the Nazi Holocaust as an instance of continuities of colonial genocide and apartheid, and that continued to inform the Zionist project. I really want it to be the last time I have to say, hi, I'm Joe the Jew, because I think one of the terrains, when you speak about the nature of Zionism, I recently read a phenomenal article by Maya Cable talking about compulsory Zionism and genealogies of, I'm going to get the name wrong, I'm sorry, but the relationship between this idea of compulsory Zionism, this idea that there is, and she riffs off the notion of compulsory heterosexuality, this idea that there is one way to be human in the world, and that is to acquiesce to compulsory forms of discursive terrains that narrate what is a settler colonial genocidal fascist occupation in Palestine through the lenses that privilege Israel, subjugate Palestine, and in fact circumscribe the boundaries of leftist movements transnationally. And I've been thinking about compulsory Zionism, and I've also been thinking about compulsory fascism. And I take some nervous liberties here, but I am hoping that with workshop in the title of this space, maybe I can just think through some incomplete ideas. But one of the things I've been thinking about is this politics of denouncement and condemnation. Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn October 7th? Do you condemn anti-Semitism? These are questions that are deeply rooted, as I understand them, in compulsory fascism, compulsory Zionism. And when Noor speaks about the nature of Zionism and the importance of understanding it, at least in my understanding, amongst global Jewry, Zionism really didn't take hold until after the Shoah, and certainly not amongst Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews. And I've been reading this book, which is a really interesting, if flawed, text, Revolutionary Yiddishland, A History of Jewish Radicalism. And one of the things it does, which I think is really important, is talks about a different but related erasure. And that is an erasure of a notion of Judaism that has always been diasporic, that has always been anti-Zionist, or has not been sometimes, let's not romanticize, the kind of socialist, leftist, Trotskyist, Leninist participation of Eastern European Jews in various collective mobilizations against capitalism, against fascism, against racism, have all but been erased from the history of Jewish life. Now, I'm cautious in saying this because I think there are some trajectories of this line of thought that seek to revive a certain notion of Judaism as if it has never been implicated in Zionist projections and projecthood. But I do think it's important to recognize that one of the things that Zionism has done, and Zionist internationalism alongside the Zionist fascist entity in occupied Palestine, has been to simultaneously and through related logics execute exterminatory genocidal projects, dispossession in Palestine, the erasure of archives, the erasure of knowledge, the dispossession of land, and various exterminatory projects in the ongoing Nakba. And at the same time, it has colonized Jewish identity. And I say this not to draw analogy or to draw them into a similar sphere of as if they can be compared, but to say if we accept that this is part of the same fascist logic that, as Noor points out, emerges around the time of Darwinism, around the time of Malthusianism, around the time of these fascist logics, what becomes apparent is that the very threatening idea of a leftist or anti-fascist or anti-Zionist Jewish identity. So if I may get a little personal also for a second, I've been reading about the Jewish Claims Conference and basically what this did in Eastern Europe after the Nazi Holocaust in Europe was to say there is no successor community to the Jews of Eastern Europe. The Jews are no longer, the Holocaust has happened, there is no Jewry. Therefore, all of this kind of rich diasporic texture, all of these forms of rebellion that we knew, our aunties singing Yiddish songs that were very jovial and joyous about, I'm gonna use my machine gun and kill a Nazi, I'm making some soup. I have a terrible voice, but this was part of a rebellion that happened in multiple different ways that was concealed and has been erased. And I think this is a really important reflection that I try to keep in mind when called upon to make this very obvious distinction between Judaism and Zionism. So I have some concerns with the idea of not in our name because it is something that is happening in Jewish name, but it is an instantiation of Judaism that goes against everything that a kind of diasporic, anti-colonial, leftist imaginary of Judaism has always conceptualized. And of course, we know that in the South African context well. So I think that's the one thing I wanted to kind of start with. And then bring it into conversation with memoricide or the idea of Holocaust memory or Jewish memories of Jewish mourning and the weaponization of that. On the one hand, to criminalize Palestinian resistance, right? If we're looking at the kind of narratives of Israeli propaganda or Hasbara that are coming out now, we are seeing Hamas and all Palestinians being equated and then being equated to ISIS and or Nazis and or all people who are not racialized as white and or black people and or Muslim people and or anti-Zionist Jews. And so what you're seeing is this kind of narrative capture. And that is, once you've decided that someone is a Nazi, you can justify any violence against them, right? Because that, in the logics of colonial understandings of genocide, as I understand it, because of the work that has been done to exceptionalize the Holocaust, to treat it as in a different analytic frame or geospatial, geopolitical, geotemporal linearity and non-linearity to colonial genocides throughout history, as anti-colonial writers such as Césaire, Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, Fanon have told us, that what was so horrifying about the Nazi Holocaust was the, as Césaire says, was the application of colonialist procedures that had taken place throughout the colonies in the metropole. So I think that's a really important analytic I have found to thinking towards the undoing of the conflation of Judaism and Zionism, is to perhaps start also by undoing how the Holocaust is memorialized. Because if I must go back to how I remember it as a Jewish person, it is certainly not through institutionalized International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance acts. It is certainly not through tethering of the memory of my ancestors to a fascist state, when it was the same fascist logics that were seeing them exterminated in their millions. And I think this is a really important point, and I think if we look at this as part of a trajectory of European colonialism, but also specifically German colonialism, if we start our memory of genocide in the 20th century with the genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama people in then Southwest Africa, now Namibia, we're seeing, and I'm saying this as a continuity, the same logic. It's not a comparison. I don't like the laboratory thesis. I think it's anti-Black in some ways. But I think we're seeing this as continuities of colonial genocide. And so one of the things I think that is useful in simultaneously honoring the memory of those who passed and not allowing that to be justified for this mythos that is created around the, terra nullius, this idea that there were no Palestinians before the colonial encounter, is to also undo this Holocaust exceptionalism. It doesn't serve Jews, it doesn't serve anyone. Jews were certainly not the only victims. And it is part of a continuum of colonial genocide that happened to receive a specific amount of juridical and international attention because of the racialized as white or liminally racialized as white character of the victims, the majority or some of the victims. So I want to kind of just end here on that point on Tina Kamp's work, The Other Germans. And she invites us to think about the Holocaust through the lenses of anti-Blackness, and to extract, instead of this view of anti-Semitism as this unique and distinct form of bigotry, to read it in conversation with a constitutive anti-Blackness of a global fascist apartheid colonial genocidal project. And this founding cornerstone being translated and transliterated into the Zionist project. In that, so I think I've been thinking a little bit, because I've been struggling with words sometimes, and I've been thinking about genocide and remembering that the so-called progenitor of the term genocide was Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish linguist. So this very legal term was developed by a linguist out of a quest to find a word for what he understood to be happening in the Nazi Holocaust in Europe. And I think it's really important then to look at this in the context of these origin stories and how these stories that are told about Israel, about genocide, about Palestine, about law, about this kind of post-1945 world order are sitting on a house of cards that is so clearly flailing right now. And as it is flailing, it is becoming so violent because it has lost so much of a cultural war. And this is where I think I've been thinking about the role of the academy, the complicities, culpabilities of the academy within this, and also the role of the intellectual, as Edward Said invited us to do, and the risks of professionalization, of becoming too close to power, and how that navigates how and we are allowed to speak freely, and also the vulnerabilities, the immense vulnerabilities at this time. And I guess one of the things I've been thinking is, how do we be brave? How do we be in solidarity in this time? And I think the point about direct links is a really important one. I'm not going to speak for too much longer, but I think there's, how am I doing for time?
You can have a couple more minutes.
Okay. I think there's a couple of grammars that maybe underlie this Zionist discourse and the kind of expansionist geographies that surround it. And one of them is a very carefully circumscribed hold on temporality. And when I was reading a bit about some of the projects at the history workshop and thinking about the production of space and place, I was also thinking about the production of time. So one of my concerns with some of the responses is how the absenting of both the Nakba, the Balfour Declaration, this whole life that existed before the contact with colonialism, that is also being narrativized through a very terrifying biblical secular theodicy almost, where you're seeing things like the Amalek narrative, these ideas of this biblical homeland, South African and Zionist organizations talking about the protection of both Jews but Christians who also see the links to a biblical homeland here. And that is a really terrifying and powerful tool combined with the kind of material factors, the arms trade, the weaponry, and the cultural arsenal. What it does is constrain, and I think I'd like to just sort of come here to conclude, unless there's, is to talk about what this does to the politics and the narratives of resistance. Because if you can own the terms and you can own the times, and you can force us, interpolate us into negotiating whether this is genocide, whether this is apartheid, whether this is settler, all these very self-evident things that we all know, but we are being interpolated into fascist conversations which really constrain the temporalities in the way, for example, the International Criminal Court does, because it cannot conceive of a notion of structure, of settler colonialism as a process, as a structure, not as an event, right? Whereas the kind of, this started on October 7th, really pushes for this genocide to be viewed in a circumscribed temporality that says that resistance is offense. And I think that's a really dangerous idea. And just to kind of bring back into the circle here, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, in terms of Jewish resistance, about this kind of lambs to the slaughter narrative, went to Auschwitz, came out victorious, Occupy, that's the socialized Zionist story all over the world, and came out, the David and Goliath story. And the danger, of that is that, there was a moment where rebellious Jews planned to poison all the water of Nuremberg, right? There's always been anti-fascist resistance. And so I think that's really to then kind of frame all resistance as encapsulated by the idea of a Zionist Jewish state is one of the key projects in sustaining the narrative. And so I think I don't have big suggestions, but I think I have a couple of closing thoughts. The one is, I think we should watch the words, watch how terms are used and abused, taken, how genocide is used, how apartheid is used and deracinated, how the language of the law is used, how the language of Judaism, Zionism, and anti-Semitism are used, how Palestinian resistance is used, how this is a deeply racial and racializing project. That's the one thing, and I think in response and in agreement with Noor, I think that might be a tool to think back around the metadata in the archive. What are things categorized as? How are they? What are the taxonomies that make this fact? What are the conditions of possibility for this fascist project? Yeah, and finally, I think just to say, that Zionism is also very much a whiteness project in many ways. And I think I have been reflecting, reading the South African Jewish Report, which is a fascist rag, about how the idea of Jewish citizenship, safety, and notions of belonging are tethered simultaneously to the existence of a Jewish Zionist state, which is not inhabited, although there is the possibility by Jewish Zionist South Africans, but also how that challenges being a diasporic settler and the whiteness and the notion of property that exists and circulates around that in the South African context. Yeah, I think these are my main points. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thanks, Joe. We have got at least almost an hour maximum, so please do put up your hands. I don't know about the online people, if they are many and have many questions or comments, or are they going to put their hands up?
Yeah, you should instruct them to.
Please put your hands up, online people, if you want to come in with a question or comment. I see Amit's hand. Should we take a few? I don't know if you have questions or you want to just have comments and discussion that doesn't require immediate responses.
So I just want to suggest, sorry if you don't mind, people can ask us questions, but I'd also like other people to respond rather than just us trying to answer everything. Yeah?
Okay, good.
Thanks, Noor. Thanks, Joe. I'm sorry that I missed part of the presentation. I've just been running and dealing with today's upload, so there's all of the stuff that needs to be resolved. Because I didn't engage the presentations properly, I just want to come in on something that Noor was talking about, right? And I guess it's looking for a response, but it's more of a comment. So, part of the Zionist propaganda, as Noor was saying, around the question of Eurasia and so on, deals with the question of a Palestinian national identity. And there's the idea that, there were no Palestinians until I think they claimed the 60s or something, like, post-67. There was, that's when you actually see the Palestinian identity claim. And it seems clear to me that, that there is a kind of pre-existing Palestinian identity that goes at least further back than the constitution of the State of Israel. But here's the where I want to come in, and it's a kind of a Fanonian point, is about the relationship between the development of national identities and colonial resistance. That is, to the extent that there's a Palestinian national identity that might precede, Zionist settler colonialism. I think we also need to emphasize the ways in which, and not shy away from them, that there is, a very distinct national identity that takes shape in the context of opposition to colonialism. And then I guess here is where I get into a place that I sometimes, when there's a kind of ambivalence about, my own position. So to the extent that I believe that, part of our political challenge is to transcend nationalist identities in kind of, and so on, towards a kind of politics of internationalism, to use a term that's maybe become a little bit anachronistic, but we need to reclaim. And in that context, and like for me, the whole two-state, I like the PFLP because they never gave up on the one-state solution in a kind of secular state and so on. And given that, there is a lot of support for a kind of two-stage framework, two separate nations, and that is how people identify. I wonder, what is the point of engagement for us anarchic internationalists with the forms of identification within the Palestinian resistance movement that are shaped by, the dialectic of colonial resistance and occupation in the formation of a national identity. So it's like a long question and so on, but hopefully you understand why this is important for me. Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Thanks for lovely presentations. I'm Kelly. I wanted to ask, maybe with a similar kind of political question to what Ahmed was raising, but less about identity and more about capital. Because it's striking to me how absent a discussion about capital is in this conversation, and I wonder why, or if you can help us understand why. And Noor, I think very importantly, right at the end of your intervention, you spoke about the politics of oil in the region, and I took that as a recognition that we have to have this as part of the conversation. But I'm wondering if oil is the only part of that conversation. It was striking to me how many Thai people were part of the hostage drama, and when, you know, there wasn't much reportage around it, except every now and again it was referenced that these were farm laborers, right? Which it seems to me is quite a crucial way also of destabilizing this kind of idea of two states continuously playing out in the way the dilemma is framed. But also, you know, notions of making the desert bloom is always under the sign of Jewishness, but it could also be under the sign of labor or of you know, other things that it seldom is. Do we speak about the kind of infrastructure around the way in which Israeli's security infrastructure has become a global capitalist project, or intelligence and information, right, infrastructure? I think we have to push ourselves to think about how not to read the drama of occupied Palestine simply in terms of identity. So it's pushing in similar directions, but thinking around capital. Thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else? Anyone online putting up your hand? Anyone else in the room? No.
Oh, I thought you had one. Do you want us to respond first and then people can warm up?
Okay, yeah, let them warm up.
Do you want to go? Or
I can, or you can.
how do you want?
You guys, you can.
Okay. Thanks, Ahmed and Kelly. I mean, these obviously, you know, important issues that, in my mind, require ongoing conversation. One of the things that I've liked about the activism around Palestine, it's always been there, but it's been more pronounced this time around. Kind of very early recognition already, and you know, Roshan made this point already on October the 7th, that we have to kind of almost watch who we are and what we say from our position in South Africa. We've got things to say, but we also have to be careful not to kind of proclaim understandings and to speak to the Palestinian situation in a way that implies that we, from our position, that we know more. Okay, and I think probably everyone in the room shares that, and I take your questions and comments in that vein as well. So I don't want to give a history lesson, although I can very easily do this, right? I do think it's important to understand the kind of evolution of something called a Palestinian identity, which is not necessarily synonymous with a national identity. So in a sense that, you know, there've been an awareness of people as Palestinian for a long time. That crystallized in particular ways in the decline and fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. And in particular with the kind of introduction of what was called the Tanzimat kind of changes, and what that meant in relation to giving greater powers to the different regions in the Ottoman Empire. And quite similar to other parts of the Middle East, including Algeria, for example, in relation to France, what one had was a kind of complex process of a kind of new administrative elite emerging that proclaimed a kind of leadership of this kind of this sort of growing identity in the different region of kind of that was also called Palestinian. They tended to be quite conservative and linked to different power players in the region. But as elsewhere, such as in Algeria, what one also had was the emergence of a kind of intellectual class, and in Palestine, you think of Edward Said, okay, as a later example of this, often Christian, and sometimes even Jewish people in Palestine connected to Europe, and in that way kind of developing a kind of intellectual elite that began to speak more openly and more explicitly about the idea of a Palestinian identity. I'm making that point so that we also have an understanding that there were different kinds of Palestinian identities taking shape that was not only kind of connected to, as it becomes more prominent in the 20th century, to the emergence of a Palestinian identity in opposition to Zionism, colonialism, and taking shape in that way. And I'm also making that point because I think that I certainly don't have this understanding, but I think that we need to kind of understand this thing called Palestinian identity also beyond the kind of, and I think this is what you're saying, in part, beyond the kind of nationalist identity, okay? Because it's certainly, I think, more complex than that. So, we're all kind of revealing kind of personal political positions. Now, some of you may have been privileged to receive a pamphlet from someone called Wiseman Hamilton, okay?
I was privileged.
You've got okay. The position that Wiseman Hamilton takes, okay, is that what we need is a socialist international, a socialist federation of the Middle East. I actually think he's absolutely right, okay? But between where we are and that, there's quite a lot of work to be done. Because that kind of view allows us to think beyond the nation state as the end point of kind of dealing with the problems that we have in the Middle East, okay? It in fact places capital and imperialism as a central register of thinking about what it is, right? That it's not simply about supposedly two people having to find each other and a way of living peacefully, either in a secular modern state or as separate kind of ethnic identities, ethno-religious identities. But they're also realities, okay? And I'm not going to draw on Stalin and the national question or even Lenin and the national question, okay? But you have to also kind of understand that there's certain realities, okay? That there is, whatever one may think about it in terms of kind of a kind of fascist idea of Zionism, there is, in real terms, the idea of a Jewish state, okay? Now, we can have an opposition to that, as we should, but it's also reality. So what do you do in real politics? My position is that the prospect of a two-state solution doesn't exist, okay? In a certain sense, so we are beyond that. So what the Zionist project has done has in fact pushed us beyond having to think about solutions in terms of these historical national identities. You've got to think beyond that, and that is where Wiseman comes in, not him personally, but that idea, okay? Because we are required to kind of think. You call it kind of anarchic internationalism, So take away the anarchic. Let's just think about internationalism, okay? But what this allows us to do is, in fact, it requires us to think in those terms, to produce politics on those terms. We don't have to be encumbered by this old kind of rubrics of nationalism. That's just, so let's have a kind of a conversation about, so yes, I was, the question of, kind of two, three quick points, Kelly. I think that the kind of current crisis in Gaza allows us, and I see Patrick is online, and maybe Patrick will make some points about sub-imperialism, okay? I think that what the Gaza crisis at the moment allows us to do, or rather it's a really fascinating lens to understanding the crisis of global capitalism. So even as it appears that global capitalism, as it has been ascendant, but it's not consolidated this kind of hegemony It's a weak, fragmented, internally contradictory, and internally contested system. And this is a fascinating lens to try and kind of, comprehend that. I wish Naeem was here, because he gave a wonderful talk a few weeks ago, giving a sense of some of these contradictions, okay? Because it allows us, for example, to understand the vagaries of this phenomenon called the petrodollar, which kind of oiled imperialist intervention in the Middle East and configuring the nature of imperialist interventions and the different kind of powers and sub-imperial kind of categories in that region, without kind of understanding the importance of the petrodollar linked to the military-industrial complex, right? Because in simple terms, what one had was that these kind of oil companies produced kind of billions and billions of dollars. Where did the money go to, right? It was invested in all sorts of companies, including kind of infrastructure and then high-tech companies in the US, but also buying billions and billions of dollars of arms, right? So you had this kind of circulation of the petrodollar that kind of integrated these different components, different parts of the kind of economic, political elite in the Middle East to global imperialism. But that is kind of, that's very unstable, and there are also the factors that have contributed to the instability. One other thing which I think one needs to take into account is how the kind of how Israel has also inserted itself into the high-tech economy, into kind of artificial intelligence as a key hub of that kind of new kind of circuit of economic development, again linked to the US high-tech companies. So the important kind of intersections that we need to kind of bring into the conversation in order to understand some of the internal contradictions emerging, not only in Israel, but in the region as a whole. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know if you want to come in and then we go around again.
I can just come in briefly on the question of capital, because I think it's something I've been thinking a lot in terms of the kind of itineraries of the circulation of capital around the Zionist project, and thinking a little bit about arms trade and the kind of the actions that have happened at Paramount that's here, that is obviously linked to the Zionist project in both military, but also kind of, I kind of am thinking about weapon production, other forms of production, and knowledge production together, and how they kind of speak to one another. I mean, just an example I've been thinking about quite a lot is the Mendel Kaplan Center the Kaplan Center at UCT, right? Which is a center for knowledge about Judaism, ostensibly, where, Kaplan's, what is it, Cape Gate, right? The steel barbed wire manufacturing organization that was also the barbed wire, provided the barbed wire for the wall. And also this kind of theme park archaeological expeditions in the 70s as part of this idea that was both supported by a kind of Afrikaner nationalism and preservation of minoritized identities and Zionist Jewish identity, kind of contributed to this kind of City of David theme park type idea that is part of the erasure of Palestinian life. And so I'm thinking a lot about the circuits of capital and what that demands, and I'm maybe just thinking about an anarchic international, what that demands in terms of a leftist, socialist / anarchic, anti-capitalist politic around this, because it really extends beyond any kind of national methodological nationalism. And also seeing how capital is used, the kind of way, Israel desalinates. Do you really want cholera, or would you like Israel? The way that that capital is used as an object of purchasing power to kind of win over hearts and minds, and kind of comes in at moments, especially throughout Africa, comes in at moments to say, well, can you refuse this? So yeah, I think it's a really important question. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks. Krishani's hand was up. I don't know if anyone else.
I'm putting up my hand to also speak, yeah.
I'm going to put my hand up as no one else is as well.
Yeah, I really am thinking aloud. And I'm happy I'm not in the circles that would have received Wiseman's pamphlet. But at the same time, I'm not dismissing the question that's at the center of it, because I think it is important. And I think, yeah, if we look at who's coming to the demonstrations, who've been there, I think, yes, it's been young people, but it's been younger people, right? It's school children. It's not, not those who are, in Wiseman's terms, completely conscientized. But let's put that aside. I think, if we look back at the kind of cycles of struggle at an international level that we've been part of over the years, and I would say my moment of defeat would have been the alter globalization movement. And in that moment, we were connecting from here through an immediate politics here that was connecting up with, immediacy elsewhere. There was some common thread that was almost immediately visible. You could feel it. But it's in that moment, and I think the defeat was around forms of organizing, and it was around against a federation, or that idea of and in the World Social Forum gatherings, there were fights around or against an international left, and I think it's important to think about what those were about, and maybe that's something we can put on our agenda to do together in a more substantial way. But I think that's, for me, is what, if we're thinking about organizing, if we're thinking about coming together, there's a very different sense at the moment of what's bringing us together. And I think, the moment resonates in very different ways because of generational questions as well. And I'm not so sure that we're making sense of this moment in terms of what's bringing that younger this generation together with us. So I think that those are, for me, also linked to what are we organizing around? It's not just identity, it's not just nation. Yes, it's capital, but how are people feeling that? And the idea of a single kind of alternative or single model that drives us, I think, is what we need to be thinking together against.
Patrick Bond's hand was up.
Right, if it's okay for me to join Kelly, Joe, and Noor in asking what is the character of capitalism, and especially an imperial relation that's very obvious. So just give me a moment to tell you what one of the presidential candidates in the US has said. I'll tell you his name. It's mostly men running. Actually, there's a very neocon woman as well, Nikki Haley. I wonder who said the following on November 5th. What do? We make sure we have the resources that are critical to us, including the oil resources that are critical to the world, that we have a strike capacity to make sure that to be able to protect these. Israel is critical. The reason it's critical is because it's a bulwark for us in the Middle East. It's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. He goes on, of the $3 billion in military gifts, and now there's a $14 billion aid package being put together, quote, 75% of it goes to US companies. And finally, crucially, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East now, Iran is closest allies with Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil. Hezbollah is in Venezuela. They've propped up the Maduro regime, so they control that oil supply. BRICS. Saudi Arabia is now joining BRICS. So this speaks to the petrodollar that Noor mentioned. Continuing the quote. So those countries will control 90% of the oil in the world. If Israel disappears, Russia and China would be controlling the Middle East, and they control 90% of the world's oil supply. And that would be cataclysmic for US national security. Now, was that Joe Biden who's running that policy? Was it Donald Trump who would do it even more so? It was actually RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., believe it or not. So he's normally anti-empire, but that incredible importance of a sub-imperial ally, and it's not just a sub-imperial Israel. Obviously, it's sub-imperial Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt that have been crucial. So what the BRICS have been doing today and tomorrow in Durban with their so-called Sherpas, this weird word that shows the sort of behind-the-scenes managers led by Anil Suklal, the host from the South African Dirk Cup. They're trying to figure out, first, Argentina's about to jump out, but what does it mean to have Iran on one side, but India and especially these proto-fascistic Arab regimes, Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt, which are generally supporting Israel, but now are in a very tricky situation. So part of this question of imperialism and sub-imperialism is really about this extraordinary turmoil where BRICS generally pulls together sub-imperial politics of multilateral reform. They're doing that today in the UAE, in the big climate summit, where the BRICS and the West are completely united. But it brings me to the question, because military relations, as Joe was getting into, is critical. So to those of you in the panel or in the House, can I ask about three guys who represent certain fractions of capital? Ivor Ichikowicz, Johnny Copeland, and Rob Hersov. So Ichikowicz, as Joe's mentioned, is Paramount Group, a military group. They're in league with Elbit. That's the main military industrial complex firm in Israel. And what they're doing is putting their Mbombe militarized carriers together with Israeli high-tech security and making a better, more effective vehicle to fight the populace of Ecuador. That's who's buying a bunch of these. Second, Paramount has a Tel Aviv office. Third, a very interesting curiosity in the cultural terrain, maybe, Joe, you can reflect on it, is the Teflon Bank that the Ichikowicz family runs, which is to give spiritual support to the IDF with this leather strap. So I can't interpret it, but I don't know if there's a sort of important value of this muti, but it certainly is an ideological relationship between Ichikowicz, the foundation, and the IDF. Now, that brings me finally to this point about why is that so important? Ichikowicz Family Foundation is the #1 donor to the ANC. The new disclosure reports yesterday confirmed that the 1.5 million rand that Ichikowicz Family Foundation gave earlier this year is still the biggest chunk. Now, ANC is going to go bankrupt with 150 million rand finding against them that they didn't pay their poster bills from 2019, which brings us to Copeland, who gave Cyril Ramaphosa 2 million rand and is also part of a sort of softer Zionism, but still part and parcel of going to Israel. Now, the third is more wicked, right? Rob Hersov, he comes from the Joburg Angloval mining fortune. I'll finish, yeah. And anyway, he's comparing Orania to Israel as the kind of place he wants to live in. And when he was at Palestine, he saw Palestinian supporters in Sea Point the other day and went viral with his, fuck these guys kind of comment. Do you have any comment about these three characters and what we can do in an oppositional way to counteract the power of that sort of Zionist extreme capital? And their hold, I think, over at least the first two, Ichikowicz and Copeland, hold over the ANC.
Thanks, Patrick. Noor, you wanted to come in. Please do put your hands up, people.
No, but you go first, yeah?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say that I think we can't determine anyway what the outcome will be of the Palestinian struggle. Sure, we can have our ideas. Personally, a democratic secular state, which had been the PLO's program, had always been the one that I thought would make the most sense and would forward a left agenda or progressive agenda the most. I mean, if you actually do end up with that, that will mean the whole of the Middle East will have changed so drastically anyway. We might well have achieved Weizmann's outcome at that moment. I mean, it's so, it's so volatile, it's so hard to predict. Also, the question of the power of oil versus arms industry, it's so, there's so many variables, and at the moment things are so volatile, because you can see Biden finally came under pressure from people in America, including the JV, the Jewish Voice for Peace lobby that's taken over stations and so on. So in this last few days, he was actually saying, oh no, can't we extend the so-called ceasefire, which isn't a ceasefire, it's whatever a pause in a genocide is. And Netanyahu said no. So what does that mean? There's all kinds of things going on there. The important thing is that we support the resistance, we support the Palestinian people in their entirety, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of the fragmentation that the apartheid Zionist state has made, where you have the Gaza Strip, where you have now all the West Bank towns and villages are practically sealed off since October the 7th. I was talking to someone there in Ramallah, and they were saying it's now even harder to get between places, to get from Ramallah to Jerusalem and so on, because they've closed a lot, they've kind of sealed off and closed a lot of the checkpoints, so you have to go all missioning around, and then they're just randomly grabbing people from cars and shooting people. I mean, it's been the deadliest year in the West Bank, and since October the 7th, so many people in the West Bank and in have been killed, shot by occupation soldiers and by illegal settlers. There are more pogroms that have taken place. So I think we mustn't fall into that trap as in the solidarity movement. It's genocide because it's genocide against the Palestinian people everywhere, the erasure, the ethnic cleansing. That's the project. That's why it can be described, I suppose, as fascist or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's important to remember that, because then the resistance isn't just the Islamic resistance movements of Hamas and PIJ. Yes, we support all forms of resistance, and they have the legitimate right to take up arms. And what happened on October the 7th, you know, the Zionist lies all the time. Now, even the Zionist Israeli newspapers are saying that a lot of the civilian casualties, because of course, how would the Hamas fighters know? There was a music festival at 6 in the morning. If you were going from Gaza to the nearest either military post, and those aren't really civilians in my view, people who stay in those so-called kibbutzes, they're really settlements because you're so close to the fence, you're there knowingly. One of the people that was killed was a South African woman who turned out to be the wife of a person who had moved, the Afrikaners had converted, I think it was just after 94, moved to Palestine, set up an illegal outpost in Masafayata in the South Hebron Hills, which now are villagers who are resisting by simply just refusing to leave. I mean, the houses are smashed up every day, the schools are smashed up. That's a form of resistance, simply by refusing to leave somewhere in spite of everything. Anyway, it was South African who was on record on YouTube snippet. I think it was a film by, not B'Tselem, one of the Israeli human rights things, saying how wonderful apartheid was and how he had left South Africa because apartheid, in effect, apartheid had been dismantled, and now he's so happy now he's doing apartheid there. And his wife was one of the so-called innocent victims that was reported to have been killed. She was visiting her daughter, who is now in one of these kibbutz settlements close to the Gaza fence. So the notion of who's a civilian is also questionable. The fact that the Zionist press totally lies about what the Hamas fighters have done and are doing, but still, I think whether it's the Islamic resistance, whether it's the PLO factions resistance in the West Bank mostly, whether it's the new forms of young people who are coming together either from no political faction or different ones coming together like the Lion's Den and the Jenin Brigades, which is a very interesting development and signals another way in which there's a sort of a unity beyond the traditional political forces driven by young people, in a way more like self-defense units in those refugee camps. And they're getting hammered, hammered by raids and, by the occupation forces on a daily basis since October the 7th. So I think, that it doesn't, in the short term, it's the progressive line, whether you're an anarchist internationalist or a communist or someone just driven by a humanitarian response to seeing a genocide on your TV screen, is to support the Palestinian resistance in its entirety, all forms of resistance at this moment. So I thought I'd just say that, and then also, it has to lead to action of some sort, because otherwise it's too despairing. And I think WITS PSC has been going on all this time, but it's been difficult to connect with academics and staff. In 2021, there was an upturn with the Unity Intifada, and I think, by the way, this is it's an ongoing Unity Intifada. There is a shift in Palestinian politics as well. But I think it's important to maintain that now connection with the student PSC, which has been going along all this while, and upswinging in 2021, but not having the connection with the organized grouping of academics in solidarity makes it harder for them to raise up, for instance, the academic boycott. And I think that's a really good one here, because we know that BITS is complicit. We know that it's connected directly to various interests of apartheid Israel. So it would be very powerful. It would be very maybe difficult for that reason, and maybe taking a risk for academics to really challenge this. But we know that would make it a very powerful, a kind of an action. And at the same time linking up, as faculties or departments, or hopefully ultimately institutionally, with Palestinian universities and with, of course, Palestinian academics in the diaspora as well. And also there's like a gazillion Palestinian academics and academic texts and intellectuals to draw on for research and for teaching and so on, for academics here. And people are always, Palestinians are always very happy to connect with South Africans because of our histories of struggle and so on. So that was what I wanted to say to WITS academics and students as well. But I don't know if there are really no more points or questions. Oh, good, there's one.
I think I would like to say, so for the people online.
Yeah.
They're not putting out.
Hi, can you hear me now? Roshan, it's related to what you were saying about, and sort of you also, Prof, around the personal links with the universities or personal links with people in Palestine. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on what you imagine would come from these personal links, whether it's with the academic institutions or just the general population in the diaspora or in Palestine. So that's my first question. And I also have a question for you, Joe. You mentioned, like within Zionist circles in South Africa, there's discussion or a desire between Jewish people and Christian people to sort of claim the Holy Land, or there's some sort of emotional link to the place. In those conversations, do Muslims feature anywhere? Or obviously I'm Muslim, are we not accounted for? Must we just go find another place? Must we go to Saudi? Is that our place? I'm wondering if you can just elaborate on that. You also said something very important. You said, I don't remember your exact words, but something about something failing. You spoke about it when you said about a house of cards, and you said there was a failure. So are you talking about a propaganda failure or some sort of mess that is happening now? I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that.
Thanks. Did you have your hand up, Amit? Oh, was there someone else? Do you want to go ahead and then they can come back on all the points?
Wait, Amit.
So I sort of just want to come back and reinforce some of what you guys have already said about the character of our support for Palestine. And it's partly my kind of, where my question was coming from, is that, I find massive problems with people speaking, with the line to someone else who's actually facing the firing squads. And I guess, so so I want to say two things here, right? So the one thing is, at the moment with the US, there's, like massive calls. Why don't you kind of condemn, what the Israeli state is doing, and the kind of State Department response is, well, it's not really up to them, you know what I mean, in order to critique, you know what I mean, the Israeli state, given what they face, and it's of course a double standard in their kind of policy and so on. And I'm not raising an equivalence here, right? So I think, there's a big difference facing genocide and how you speak to, you know what I mean, the person arming the genocide nation, and on the other side. But I guess this is sort of where the project that I thought this is the beginning of can actually make its intervention. That is not speaking on behalf of or speaking the line to, but reflecting on the experience of Palestine from our own experience. And that our critical gaze then is more reflection on our experience rather than a vanguardist mode of telling the Palestinians on how they should struggle. But for me, being a kind of up and down revolution, meaning that sometimes I'm a revolutionary, sometimes I'm sometimes I don't have the energy to sustain it. I guess what I've also seen about this particular moment is how, you know, a lot of the contradictions of kind of colonialism, neoliberalism, and so on, are almost distilled and taken to the point of exception that proves the rule. You know what I mean? And so, for me, you know, the importance of Palestine is also in showing us how we might fight and how we might create new frameworks of international solidarity. So, I mean, like, partly, you know, with this kind of project, and so maybe I'll say a little bit about it, right? So this event is the first of a series of teachings. And the idea was, and it's still open to shaping and so on, is that we would collectively undertake a research process that would end in some writing project about apartheid and the limits also of just speaking about apartheid in relation to Israel. And so here, you know, like we begin with something about, you know, the kind of roots of settler colonialism. That also talks about, you know, the links between what happened in late 19th and early 20th century Palestine, as well as South Africa. And then go and talk about, you know, post the Balfour Declaration and, you know, the 1948, and work ourselves up to, you know, kind of understand the character of the resistance movements and so on, as well as this important period in the 1990s, you know, where you have Oslo and you've got our kind of weird transition going on as well. And on that basis, inviting people into a discussion about what are the strategies of anti-fascist activism, of anti-racist activism, and anti-capitalist activism. You know what I mean? In these places, and how can they be generalized into a broader movement? I mean, I agree with Prashant that, you know, one of the big things about the World Social Forum was exactly the question, not so much about should we have an international movement, because they were taken for granted that we should, but what should the form of that be, and what are the organizational forms that are appropriate to a kind of, you know, decentralized, non-vanguardist movement. And I think that question is with us without us telling people we already have the answer. But I think that is the most critical question for us as well. And I do think it's important also for us to be able to say that, you know, like, maybe I'm uncomfortable by this strategy. You know what I mean? But my opposition to the Israeli state, to genocide and so forth, that is without question, as well as the affirmation of the right to resistance. And yeah, I guess that is the challenge of how, in a non-vanguardist, non-appropriating voice, to be able to kind of speak politics that is not just, you know, support, but also building a movement for all of us.
Thanks. Do you want to have a few minutes each?
Sure.
It's 10 to...
You go.
I have to start a online meeting at 4, but if you want to go over a little bit...
No, we can end
Okay.
off now. Yeah.
Okay.
Easily.
Thanks.
So, Joe, it's a few minutes. Each.
So I think to the last point from Ahmed, I think on the question of resistance, I really struggle to approach this with any approach that is not just with immense humility and recognition of the fact that I cannot possibly conceive what it means to live this genocidal fascist settler colonial death camp that Israel has produced in Palestine, and to still do so with life and joy and food and togetherness and kinship. So I have no interest in myself kind of dictating, and I think that applies both to the kind of, if this is a settler colony, if this is a genocide, then there is necessarily resistance, there must be. And I think maybe also to Roshan's point earlier, I think there's also this quite, so in certain strands of leftist thought, there's also fixation on secularity, right? Which I think also undermines the multiplicitous forms of resistance that exist. So that's to that point. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Okay, that's okay. What I was referring to, and so I think you had two questions as I understand. One is the kind of Jewish and Christian homeland space, and the other is the House of Cards. So in particular, there was a response by Sarah Gunn from the South African Institute of Race Relations, our white supremacist think tank masquerading as something else. And one of the things I think she was raising was, that this is, the Jews are no longer safe, the Jews are no longer, and this is not just about the Jews, there are also many Christians, so no. There's a deep-seated Islamophobia there as well, and it's the fascist genocidal kind of expansionism is in the mind as well. So from what I'm reading. At the same time, I think my sense, and I'm, again, just speaking aloud from, there's a sense that there's a cultural battle in certain spaces that Zionism used to have some kind of hegemony over, that it's losing. So I think that we went through the Holocaust, therefore we can do it. We are unimpeachable. We are the eternal victims, but also the eternal heroes. We can defend. We have the right to self-defense because never again, etc., etc. In that space, I think that there is less and less resonance because they have denuded the Holocaust of its meaning so significantly, denuded anti-Semitism of its meaning so significantly, that it's losing. It's certainly in many, many spaces, but in this, maybe because I've got a bit of an anarchist kind of prefigurative in me, there's cracks. I think it's cracking, and I think where it's cracking, it's doubling down on really violent narratives, but it's losing a part of a cultural battle. I mean, if we look at the streets here, if we, and everywhere, the way people are coming out, and are we doing enough, and should we be? But I think there are cracks in some kind of hegemony that it used to hold in certain quarters, and that I think the road is long, but I sometimes call it the unsettling of the shtetl, this kind of idea of an imaginary diaspora that exists, that is kind of being revisited outside of both Christian and Jewish forms of Zionism, and filtering down into mediatized spaces, I think, outside of, so.
Thanks. You want to?
You done?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much. A few points, and just again bullet points. Okay. I hope, Ahmed, that one of the conversations we can have is about fascism, and whether, in fact, the Zionist regime is a fascist regime. I'm not. It's a question. Okay. Because it's a kind of description that has crept into our solidarity discourse, but I'm not sure whether there has been sufficient discussion. There may have been in certain spaces, but certainly not in our certainly not in the spaces that I kind of involved in. But it's become a kind of a kind of easily used label. So I'd like to see some conversation about that. I think that we need to, in terms of direct links and personal connections, kind of academic connections, as Roshan has said, this has been done over time at different points. Some of it have been in existence longer than others. I'm hoping that what we can do, and when I say we're meeting here at WITS, WUPAC, but we're connected to, different, there's a kind of university committee, and there are other things happening. It doesn't only have to be via universities, that we build these connections and we shape the nature of those connections with our partners in Palestine, so that we don't determine here that is what we want to do, and we find people, and I mean those, I suppose Haider is perhaps a kind of almost an exemplar of what has been done over kind of 15, 20 years, and how fundamentally important that kind of political, personal, professional connection can be in terms of building the solidarity. So if that is the exemplar, then I'm suggesting we need to aspire in different ways, to kind of doing that. The point I was going to make, I didn't respond to Kelly's point about the tie, because the other side of capital is labor, and I think that one of the conversations, that one of the things we need to thread through our discussion is about Palestinian labor in relationship to the Israeli state, and how, in fact, Israel is quite similar in the way that it is drawing on labor from, South Asia, in the same way as the kind of Gulf states are doing from other parts of Africa. And there's a labor project. There's also an ideological project that one needs to kind of be take into account. And one of the important differences between South Africa and in Israel is that South African capital was absolutely dependent on black labor. It's not the same in Israel, okay, in relation to Palestinian labor. And this has got to do with demographics, but in fact it's quite central to the Zionist project. In the 1920s, when the Nieftagodien was established in the early 1920s, it had two key principles. One, that only Jewish workers could be members of the trade union. So when we had the 1922 strikes and people were striking, workers of the world unite for a white South Africa, the Nieftagodien was doing something similar in Israel, and also secondly campaigning for Jewish companies to only employ Jewish workers. So this kind of nationalist project was quite central to capital and therefore to labor. So we need to kind of bring that into our conversation. I think it's been quite interesting, and I'm sure other people know a lot more about this. And my point about us needing to understand Palestinian resistance more and better is specific because I simply don't know, and I think maybe the same applies to many people. So one of the things that's kind of emerged in the critique of Hamas is that people kind of quite easily say that it was a project of the Israeli government, okay? In the 1980s with the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore, okay, so that kind of gets sort of mixed up in the critique of Hamas. What we need to do is be able to understand the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood, what the first Intifada did to kind of begin to fracture the kind of way that the Muslim Brotherhood operated in Egypt and in Palestine, and how Hamas emerges out of that, okay? And of course, Israel has always tried to intervene, and not only Israel, by the way, Saudi Arabia, okay, constantly trying to influence the kind of the politics of resistance in Palestine. And so I'm making that point as well, because I want to say that absolutely, for me, there's no question that we unequivocally support the resistance of the Palestinian people against the genocide. But I'm an internationalist, okay? And therefore I support the liberation struggle of oppressed and exploited people in the world. I see myself as part of that. And I therefore see that I have a responsibility to have critical solidarity for international struggles. And therefore I don't unquestionably, or rather uncritically support everything, okay? I feel that I have a right and a responsibility to engage in conversations without the conceit of thinking that I have the vanguardist answers and can speak to other people who are facing genocide and the firing squad. So I think that we need to kind of find a way of engaging them. So my final point, because I agree with almost everything that has been said, my final point is kind of linked to what the point that Joe has made. And that is, I have been surprised, and maybe it shows that I'm getting slightly older than I think I am, that, in the first week after October the 7th, it appeared that the pro-Zionist lobby globally would systematically silence and prevent mobilization of the anti-genocide pro-Palestinian movement. And I've been surprised by how quickly that armor of pro-Zionism has been kind of disrupted, okay? From Washington all over, despite what the global powers have done to try and silence the opposition movement. For me, that has been fascinating, and we need to think about the implications of that for, I think that was what Prashania said, what it means for kind of beginning to think differently, or to help think with this emerging movement about the sort of new forms of international struggles. Because what Gaza does is it kind of, as you said, kind of crystallizes, it brings all these problems together in kind of one space in one short time, and there's an opportunity for internationalists to engage in this in the way that we are already, with kind of real solidarity, but also think about the possibilities of kind of injecting new energy into internationalist movements. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'll close up there. I hope that that means that you will all be active in BDS work, because that is a weapon. Otherwise, it's just talking, and it's a weapon because it's part of our struggle here as well. If you're challenging this university on this issue, you're continuing the challenge to the university that you've undertaken with Fees Must Fall, with all sorts of other things.
Drinking the right water.
So I hope that maybe WUPAC could consider being a member of the BDS coalition, and then you can influence also the decision making. It's a very open structure. Sorry, I really have to start this meeting now. I've got a French Chicani is calling me to say,
The picket is supposed to happen